Welcome to System 2.
Today, we're going to talk about one of the most important and honestly one of the most troubling figures of the 20th century, a German scientist named Fritz Haber. His story is just full of these massive contradictions. He's a man whose genius literally saved billions from starving, but who also unleashed industrialized death on the world. He was a patriot who was ultimately rejected by the very country he loved, a Nobel laureate, and a man whose legacy we are still wrestling with today.
And to really get a sense of Haber's impact, you have to start with his Nobel Prize. Look, this wasn't just another award. You can make a really strong case that this was the most important Nobel ever handed out. Why? Because the discovery it recognized didn't just push science forward, it completely changed the path of human history. It literally made our modern world possible.
But right away, here's the paradox at the heart of it all. How can one man be both a savior and a monster? On the one hand, his invention for creating fertilizer is directly responsible for feeding half the planet's population. That's 4 billion people. But on the other hand, his name was so hated that when he got that Nobel, other winners refused to even show up, and 2 of them actually rejected their own awards just to protest him. So how does that happen? That's the question we're digging into. To even start to understand this guy, we've got to go back to the beginning. We need to look at what made him tick. His ambition, his identity, and this just desperate need he had to belong.
So Fritz Haber was born into a Jewish family, but his whole identity was shaped by this intense German nationalism. He was ambitious, he was extravagant, and he was just dying to fit in. But as a Jew in that society, he kept hitting walls. He talked about this urge to extricate oneself from narrow surroundings, and for him, that led to a huge, life-changing decision. He converted to Christianity. He saw it as the only way he could move up in his career and become the true German he so badly wanted to be.
And you know, his friend, a guy you've probably heard of, Albert Einstein, he absolutely nailed Haber's personal struggle with this one sentence. He said, "It was the tragedy of the German Jew, the tragedy of unrequited love." Just think about that for a second. Unrequited love. Haber spent his entire life showing this deep, passionate love for Germany, a love that, in the end, was tragically not returned.
But before that tragedy played out, Haber's intense patriotism and his scientific brain would come together to solve one of the greatest crises humanity had ever faced. He was about to figure out how to literally make bread from thin air.
Okay, so picture this. It's the turn of the 20th century, and the world is staring down the barrel of a global famine. A top chemist at the time gave this terrifying warning that all civilized nations were in deadly peril of not having enough to eat. The problem came down to one element: nitrogen. It's the key ingredient for fertilizer, which you need to grow crops. For centuries, we've been getting it from natural sources, like giant piles of bird droppings in South America. Seriously. But we were running out, and the world's population was exploding. People were going to starve. Now, the crazy thing is, the solution was literally all around us. The air we're all breathing right now, it's about 78% nitrogen. But there was a massive catch. The nitrogen in the air, N2, has 2 atoms that are locked together by one of the strongest chemical bonds in all of nature. It's like they're in a death grip. And plants can't break that bond, so all that nitrogen in the air is completely useless to them. The big challenge was figuring out how to crack it open. And this is where Fritz Haber did what everyone thought was impossible. He came up with a process that basically mimicked the conditions deep inside the Earth. I mean, think about this. You take nitrogen from the air, mix it with hydrogen, and then you crush it under pressure 200 times what we feel every day. Well, you bake it at 500 degrees Celsius. That's hot enough to melt lead. Under these insane conditions, and with a little help from a catalyst like iron, that unbreakable nitrogen bond, it finally shatters. And the result? A steady drip of liquid ammonia, the magic ingredient for synthetic fertilizer. The impact was just world-changing. I mean, with the fertilizer from this Haber-Bosch process, a farmer could suddenly grow 4 times as much food on the exact same piece of land. The global famine that was right around the corner, gone. The world's population could now continue to grow. But there was a hidden price tag, one we're really feeling today. The process uses a massive amount of energy. It now eats up over 1% of the entire world's energy supply, making it a huge contributor to climate change. So, at this point, Haber is a hero. He saves the world. But this is where his story takes an incredibly dark turn. Because when war broke out in Europe, the same patriotism that pushed him to feed his country now pushed him to arm it. So, August 1914.
Unlike pacifists like his buddy Einstein, who thought the war was a disaster, the 45-year-old Fritz Haber volunteered for duty immediately. No hesitation. For him, this was the ultimate expression of his patriotism. He was going to put his incredible mind completely at the service of the German war machine.
And his contributions were huge, and they were devastating. First, he tweaked his Nobel-winning process. Turns out that same ammonia that makes fertilizer can also be turned into nitric acid, which is the main ingredient in explosives. So when a British blockade cut off Germany's nitrate supply, Haber's invention single-handedly kept them supplied with gunpowder, probably making the war last years longer. But his second contribution, that's the one that made him infamous. He became the father of chemical warfare. Now, in Haber's mind, poison gas wasn't some great evil. He saw it as a tool. He actually argued that it was a way to break the horrible bloody stalemate of trench warfare. He called it a higher form of killing, believing that if it ended the war faster, it would actually save lives in the long run. It's a pretty chilling way to think about it, and with that logic, he personally went to the front lines to recruit the best young scientists for his new chemical weapons unit. And the results of his work were immediate, and they were horrific. On April 22, 1915, Haber was right there at the front near a town called Ypres. He personally watched as 168 tons of chlorine gas were released against Allied soldiers. The gas sank into the trenches, and it killed thousands in a new and terrifying way. Just 10 days later, he's back home in Berlin. His wife, Clara Emmerwahr, who was a brilliant chemist herself and called his work a perversion of science, found his military pistol and shot herself in the chest. The very next morning, Haber left for the Eastern Front to go supervise more gas attacks. The war did eventually end, but the fight for Haber's soul was really just getting started. He was celebrated with a Nobel Prize for feeding the world, but he could never, ever escape the shadow of arming it. And in the end, the country he sacrificed everything for would betray him in the cruelest way possible. Just to show you how deep his loyalty ran, in 1914, Haber, along with 92 of Germany's most famous minds, signed this thing called the Manifesto of the 93. It was basically a piece of propaganda that denied Germany was guilty of starting the war and defended everything it did. For Haber, signing this wasn't just putting his name on a piece of paper. It was a public declaration of his absolute unconditional love for his country. And then you have this. Fast forward almost 20 years, the Nazis are in power. They pass a law to fire all Jews from government jobs. Haber, who's the head of a major scientific institute, gets an order: fire all your Jewish scientists. And this is what he writes back. After spending his entire life trying to be the perfect German, even sacrificing his own morals for his country, that same country was now telling him that none of it mattered. All they saw was the Jewish heritage he had tried so hard to erase. Now, technically, he was a war veteran, so he was exempt from the law, but he resigned in protest. The man who gave Germany both bread and bombs was now forced to run for his life. He wandered around Europe, a man without a home, and just a year later, he died of heart failure in a hotel in Switzerland. He was completely and utterly broken. The unrequited love story had reached its tragic end. But there is one final, horrifying twist in Fritz Haber's legacy, and it's a connection that gets misunderstood a lot, so we need to be really careful and really precise here. Okay, so it's absolutely essential to get the facts straight. After World War I, Haber's Institute developed a pesticide called Zyklon A. It was based on cyanide. To make sure no one got poisoned by accident, they deliberately added a powerful warning chemical to it so it would smell awful. It was literally designed to save human lives. It wasn't until a decade after Haber was dead that other scientists working for the Nazis took that formula, removed the warning smell, and turned it into Zyklon B, the poison used to murder millions of people in the gas chambers of the Holocaust. Haber did not invent the tool of genocide, but his science was twisted and perverted into one. Which brings us right back to the central problem of Fritz Haber's wife, and it's a question that's more relevant than ever today. He wanted to control nature, to bend it to his will, for his country, for both good and for evil. His story really forces us to ask, what is the ultimate responsibility of a scientist? When you create something new, something powerful, and you let it out into the world, are you responsible for all the ways it might be used, or twisted into something horrible long after you're gone?